back to the Which Carolina podcast. This is Lee Branscombe, and I've got a guest with me today, Noah Magaro-George, who is a Spurs writer. He's a contributor at Pound the Rock. He's a co-host at the Line Pod, and we wanted to bring him on. Spurs preview, NBA season is upon us now. So thanks a lot for joining the Which Carolina podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I always love talking about Spurs and the NBA, so I'm totally ready to talk.
Well, you got the good Spurs merch behind you for anyone who is going to watch this on YouTube. For anyone who is listening to the audio version of our podcast, just know that Noah's got some pretty sick Spurs merchandise behind him. Tell me this, Noah, how did you kind of forge a path into sports media? And then more generally, is it just a hometown thing? Are you a Spurs guy? How did all this come about, I guess?
Yeah, so I was I was born in El Paso, but raised in San Antonio my whole life. I was in San Antonio by the time I was, a few months old, and they're pretty much the only sports team out there, and just a product of them, having success, winning championships and growing up around that. It was hard not to be a fan. My parents really love basketball. They were big Spurs fans. They kind of brought me into that. And for me, some of my first memories of really being a Spurs fan, solidifying that, was the 2005 championship where they played the Pistons. And, that was a time where I'm, about 10 years old now. I'm really starting to, love the game, like watching, the team, knowing every player, knowing every team on every, across the league. And I just continue to fall in love. I mean, they only won 2 after that, which is more than a lot of other franchises can say. But, that was what for me really spurred, falling in love with basketball, really following this team. And then I went to the University of North Texas, studied journalism there. I focused in broadcast media. I did a lot of sports stuff when I was there, and I just continued that, after I exited school. And that's kind of what my path has been. I've been trying to work my way through the ranks of the San Antonio sports media, trying to cover the Spurs. And it's been a ride. It's been a wild ride, because I've had this ride where, close to when I was graduating, the Spurs and that Kawhi Leonard drama started heating up. And then it's been, a pseudo rebuild into a full, to me, what is going to be a full blown rebuild probably in the next couple of years.
That's perfect. So that's kind of a perfect transition. And yeah, remember, you're talking to a Charlotte fan here, so don't get too greedy with your titles. No, I'm just joking. You guys, I mean, what a run. And I think any basketball casual fan, but especially basketball kind of junkies and purists, have a healthy respect for the beautiful game that those Spurs championship teams played. And you kind of alluded perfectly. So I wanted to set up just kind of the last 3-4 seasons, basically. So 16-17, Spurs are a 61 win team. Kawhi goes down in the Western Conference Finals, which that's one of the great what ifs, right? If he doesn't turn his ankle, how does that series play out? Obviously, that's a dynastic Warriors team, but now knowing what we know about how great Kawhi is in hindsight, who knows where that series would have gone. 17-18, 47 wins, still a pretty good team, but Kawhi is mostly out that entire season. Losing the first round of the Warriors. Kawhi's traded that summer, 18-19, you get back to DeRozan and Poeltl. 48-34, still a pretty solid team, losing the first round to Denver in 7 games. 19-20, and this is where I'll turn it over to you. You missed the playoffs for the first time since like before World War II, I believe, and barely missed the playoffs, and really probably come out of the bubble feeling pretty good about kind of the young rebuild that you alluded to. So I guess my question for you is, what were your thoughts coming out of the bubble about the young core, and which player maybe are you most focused on their development moving forward?
Yeah, so I mean, in the bubble, it was completely different style of basketball than we're used to seeing. Before the bubble, it was a team that was centered around LaMarcus Aldridge, around DeMar DeRozan, and we had guys like Marco Bellinelli, Brent Forbes, Rudy Gay, Patty Mills receiving 20 plus minutes per night. And this just, if you were, watched any basketball last season when the Spurs were playing, those guys, especially the last 3 that I mentioned, Bren, Marco, and Patty, their defense was atrocious. And then playing them together only compounded upon their deficiencies. And that's one of the reasons that San Antonio had one of the worst defenses in the NBA last year. I don't know the exact ranking. I think it was like 25th or 26th or something like that.
So the Spurs were 24th in defensive rating.
Okay. Yeah.
Which, yeah, not great. Not great.
Yeah, a lot worse than they had been doing in the previous season. I believe they were 17th. So it just had been kind of a downward trend. And then when you get into the bubble, you got all these young guys who fans and writers and bloggers and even analysts across the league on TV, they've been saying, look, they need to really move towards this new era of basketball, get these young guys in the game, because you have people like Lonnie Walker, Keldon Johnson, Derrick White, Dejounte Murray, people who can play defense, or guys, at least in theory, that have the athleticism to keep up on the perimeter. And they're not just blown by every possession, where now there's guys working to fill holes. And we saw that, right? We saw them play that. They ended up doing a run and gun style of basketball. They played the second fastest pace in the bubble. And it was just, it was something really fun to watch. Now, I kind of took it with a grain of salt, right? So they played a lot of teams sitting starters. They played teams sitting stars. They played teams who had guys who they added to the roster for the bubble who would normally have been in their G League system or at the very end of their bench. And, they benefited from that to a certain degree. They definitely benefited from that. But I think looking at it, there's definitely a lot of positives to take away. One, Lonnie Walker, even though he didn't have the best shooting percentages, he did flash a lot of skills that people were kind of wondering, is it real? Is it just, going to happen every few games? But throughout those games, he played really well in transition. He actually dished out some really pretty assists in transition, bounce passes, ran some fast breaks really well, and scored himself, and also just continued to shoot the ball well from 3-point range. And that's about all you can hope for him at this point. And another guy who stood out is Keldon Johnson. He's not going to shoot 60% from three. That's nobody is. But the fact that he was able to knock down the three after shooting about 25% in the G League all season, I think that's a huge improvement for him if he can continue building upon that with a guy like Chip England, who's, to me, one of the best shooting coaches in the NBA. They have something exciting to work with, because aside from that free throw rate sat right about near where Jimmy Butler and Giannis Antetokounmpo's were. And I'm not saying that that's what he's going to be, but that high free throw rate, being able to get to the line, is a really valuable skill, especially if you're going to want to be putting the ball in his hands in the future. And I think for now, he may be a little bit more of a straight line driver, somebody who's not going to have a lot of moves and counter moves. But going forward, if he can develop some of that and get to the line, I think he's somebody who the Spurs are really invested in developing, because we've seen them kind of put him to the forefront. He's been sort of a pseudo face of the franchise. He's been part of all their marketing things. He's been part of a lot of ads around San Antonio. He's been on every new, radio station there. So the Spurs clearly believe in this guy. They like him a lot. And then, lastly, I really was encouraged by what I saw from Derrick. And Derrick White isn't necessarily young, right? He was already a little bit of a late bloomer. But at 26 years old, there was a lot to like from him. We saw him break out in those 2019 playoffs against the Nuggets, and everybody thought, well, Derrick could be in the running for most improved player of the year in 2020. And that didn't happen. We saw Dejounte come back, and for most of the year, Dejounte and Derrick did not play together, but they only played when each other were not on the floor. So about 24 minutes per game for one, 24 minutes per game for the other. And then the bubble, we finally saw them playing together. That defense, especially the perimeter defense, really improved. And Derrick thrived. He had the ball in his hand, and I think he's a better distributor, better decision maker, better shooter than Dejounte. And I think he averaged through the first 5 games before he got injured, 22 points, 43% from 3 on 8 attempts, about 4 rebounds, 5 assists. So he was somebody who looked like he was going to be able to put up these all-star type numbers. Yeah. And I'm not sure if he's going to be able to do that for an entire season, but I think he could probably approach that, 18 to 19 points per game, 4 or 5 rebounds, 4 or 5 assists, and be, one of the secondary, tertiary stars next to a real superstar on a contender. I don't know when the Spurs are going to be able to bring him in, that sort of player for him to play off of, because I don't think DeMar and LaMarcus are that anymore. To me, they aren't that anymore. But I did like what I saw from Derrick.
No, I think that was a very succinct way to highlight the encouraging pieces of the young core, while also contextualizing it with the backdrop of what the bubble was and what the competition they faced and the small sample size. But there's still a lot of optimistic conclusions to draw from what you've seen. And you've got to also just be generally optimistic about Spurs player development and talent identification as well. So it's interesting that you kind of bring up some of that young core. And now that you move into the offseason, right? So, and add anything here that I'm leaving out, but essentially from a key departure standpoint, it's essentially Bryn Forbes and Bellinelli.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they lost Metu as well, but he wasn't a key part, right? He was just a project who I think a lot of people definitely were saying, like, look, it's probably the end of the road for him in San Antonio. They tried it out. Drew Eubanks ended up playing better than he did, a guy who's a little older, but definitely a little more seasoned than he is. His skills are definitely tangible, right? Like with Chimezie, it's like, can he do these things? Can they translate to the NBA? And with Drew Eubanks, it's not flashy. He's not going to put up big numbers, but he can be at the very least a serviceable backup as like a third string guy who can come in and injury insurance or depth insurance.
Yeah, very similar to the Dwayne Bacon situation in Charlotte, where it's not that you're necessarily completely convinced he won't make it in the league. It's more that you have other pieces. In our situation, it's the Martin twins and Jaden McDaniels. In your situation, it's Drew Eubanks and, of course, obviously Poeltl in more of a much more featured role. So the other kind of offseason moves, guaranteed Trey Lyles year, signed Drew Eubanks, and extended Jakob Poeltl 3 years, 26. What's your take on that contract from a value standpoint and just what Poeltl brings, I guess, from an overall roster standpoint as well?
Sure. So I wrote an article for Pounding the Rock trying to figure out what his value was, because he's a more traditional big man and those players have kind of lost their value in the NBA. So I looked at a bunch of different players with similar statistical profiles, what kind of money they're making. And it seemed to me that a fair amount would be somewhere in the 10 to 12 million range. And the fact they were able to grab him for about 8 million a year, I believe, or 9 million a year, that's really nice. That's essentially like a mid-level exception. And I really like that for them. I think he was one of the more underrated players on this roster. He was one of the best rim protectors in the league. And sure, he benefited from playing against second units mostly, but he was in the end of a lot of really close games. And for me, notably, when they played the Rockets, where, Lonnie Walker had 28 points, but the guy who made the block on James Harden at the very end to save the game, that's Jakob Poeltl. And he did those kind of things consistently. He moves better than you would expect him to, for being someone who looks kind of slow at times, but he moves pretty well. He recovers well. He's got great timing, great instincts. And on the other end, he doesn't bring a whole lot in terms of shooting, but he's got a high basketball IQ. He keeps the ball moving. He can find guys who are open when the ball's in his hands. And, the free throw shooting is definitely a pain, right? If you're shooting 50%, 49%, it's going to be tough to keep him in at the end of games, but I think he negates it with everything else he brings to the table. And again, I think he's only about 24, 25 years old. So, he still has some room to develop, room to grow. And even Pop said in a recent press conference when he was talking to the media that, look, I don't know if Jakob Poeltl has got the impression that I don't want him to score, don't be aggressive, but that's not what I want. I want him to be aggressive. I want him to score when he has those opportunities. And, fans soured on him a little bit in the bubble because he had some foul trouble, because he struggled to finish at times. But I think if we're being realistic, he finishes well enough to be in the game. He's not someone who's going to be an above the rim guy. He's not going to be, jamming on people. That's not his brand of basketball. He doesn't have that sort of pop in a crowd. But what he can do is he can have finesse finishes. He's good at that. And I think that's, at the very least, with everything else he brings on the other side of the ball, that's all you can really hope for. So I think Spurs fans got to a little bit calm it down there and say, he just can't finish. He can't dunk. He needs to dunk. Well, no one can dunk every time down. Otherwise, everyone would do it. So I think he's incredibly valuable, and I think it's a great value for this contract. I'm excited to see what he can do.
I tend to agree, and I think even more so because of the age factor that you mentioned. I mean, he is in the desired timeline for this San Antonio Spurs team with all these young guys moving forward. And I mean, like you said, to get him for under $10 million, as we have, and Charlotte, by we, are looking at kind of a potential Cody Zeller extension. He's older. He has less upside because of that. But I'm just going to be curious what those numbers look like. You look at a contract like Poeltl or Mason Plumlee, and you kind of try and start to figure out what Zeller would be worth and if he's worth keeping around. But people are here to listen about the Spurs. So from a draft pick standpoint, number 11, Devin Vassell, sophomore out of Florida State, and 41, Trey Jones, just another kind of experienced and seasoned NCAA player that's played in a lot of big games. what were your initial reactions and kind of what have you gathered through, of course, what is a very small sample size in the preseason?
Sure. So first off, like for me, I kind of always been a guy who's been interested in the draft, and I've watched a lot of college basketball over the years. But these last couple of years, I've taken upon myself to watch games, take notes, and try to write scouting reports as best as I can with whatever knowledge I have about the games and these players and the context of their situations. And for me, Devin Vassell was the 5th best guy on my big board. And when he fell to 11 for the Spurs, I was ecstatic. I think in Florida State, he played in a very equal opportunity offense, one where, they spread the wealth. They're not really running a ton of plays to get him looks. And he still was able to lead them in scoring. He flashed some self-creation here and there. And he knocked down the 3 ball at 42% through both seasons at Florida State. So I buy the 3 ball, even if the form isn't like traditionally beautiful, if that makes sense. Like, it looks a little wonky, but it gets the job done. And again, like, I hate to use this as a kind of a crutch, but working with Chip England is only going to help him get better in that area. And then on the other end is where he really impresses me. To me, he was the best team defender in this draft class. Incredible instincts, incredible IQ, just so disruptive when he gets an opportunity to get in the passing lanes and really get into people's airspace. But, I was a little concerned that he may struggle a bit on ball. He's very thin still. We saw that against the Rockets. James Harden was able to push him to the side. John Wall was able to, lower his shoulder and displace him. And, that's going to happen. But I think for as well as he's able to, rotate over as a weak side defender and be that, kind of like a secondary rim protector there. And for him to be able to just read what the offense is doing and be able to create takeaways, I think he's going to be really tremendous for the Spurs. And I liked what I've seen. He has 7 steals through the first 2 preseason games, and he's scored in double figures in both games. He's knocked down a couple of threes in both games, and there's just a lot to like from him. And I'm really excited to see what his long-term future is, because I think for me, at least, I'm buying into him being potentially, when we look, 3-4 years down the line, he could be one of the best players in this class. But it all depends on what this trajectory is. And obviously Kawhi and guys like and that kind of sort of later draft picks who turn out to be superstars, they're outliers, and you can't really compare them to everybody. But if you're looking at the Spurs developmental system, if a guy has the drive, if a guy has the talent, and if he has, the time where the Spurs system is willing to dedicate that time to developing that player, you can potentially end up with something special. We've seen it with Manu, we've seen it with Tony, we've seen it with guys like Kawhi, and to me, it wouldn't be insane to say that he has a little bit of potential to be more of a featured option as an offensive player down the road. So I'm really excited and really encouraged by what I've seen from him so far, and I think it's only going to get better from here.
Yeah. So, and to your point, I mean, I was able to rewatch the Thunder preseason game against the Spurs. I didn't see the Rockets one, but I mean, Vassell had kind of 3 different like savant level defensive anticipation steals just in that game. So it's kind of crazy. You're already seeing that kind of spidey sense level of like help side defense that he showed at Florida State. I mean, helping down on kind of like a pick and roll situation where he takes the ball away, sprinting in from out of frame on the help side to poke the ball away. And he's so long, and he already knows where the ball is going before it gets there. So, yes, I have some concerns about his top end ability to create isolation, but he honestly may not even need that to reach a level of like quality above league average starter type, because the foundational tools are already there with, the shooting that you mentioned, which I'm with you. I think the form is a little wonky, but from a statistical standpoint, the results are there. There's really nothing to argue with. Really like what you said about him. How did you view the Trey Jones pick? And what do you think? I mean, look, Dejounte Murray, Derrick White, it's going to be, and Patty Mills. I mean, it's going to be tough for him to get into the rotation probably, but Patty Mills isn't going to be there forever. I wanted to ask you about what you think a Derrick White extension may or may not look like. I think Trey Jones gives you some insurance at the point guard position and a nice guy to develop, who I thought had the best hands in the draft defensively. I mean, he will just literally take the ball from you.
Yeah, no, I really like Trey Jones. And I think on draft night, I ended up giving it the pick of B- because the Spurs just had so many guards. I wasn't sure whether they were going to fit him in. And I also was, I'm not sure if you know, but I'm a pretty big Killian Tilly stan. So I was kind of hoping the Spurs might look towards him because they're pretty low on front court depth. He was available. Of course, he went undrafted. It's probably because of his injury history.
Yep.
Because to me, if not for that, he has the sort of skills and the experience and leadership where I go, okay, well, he could potentially be a lottery talent in this class. But obviously, injuries are a part of the game. You can't avoid that. There's always going to be, with guys who have that extensive of an injury history, a bit of a red flag. So after looking through it and going, okay, well, they got Trey Jones. I like him. He's got great hands. He's a really, really pesky on-ball defender. Well, where I worry is, can he be anything more than that? Right. Sure. I mean, he's not as small as his brother Tyus.
Right.
So that's already a plus. And I think Tyus is one of the better backup point guards in the league. And I think if they can end up getting that kind of level of production from him, because I think he's a similar, like, patient, lets the offense come to him. He's not going to make incredible reads, but he understands how to get his guys the ball in favorable situations. And I don't know that there's a lot not to like about the pick. Now, maybe the upside isn't there, but in the second round, you're not really going to find a ton of future all-stars or future starters. You're gambling at all times pretty much in the second round.
So one of the kind of themes of this whole conversation, without directly talking about it, has been the divide in this roster of kind of the young developmental core versus the older expiring contracts, and frankly, still some pretty good players. So you've got Dejounte Murray, Derrick White, Lonnie Walker, Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell, Jakob Poeltl, Eubanks, Samanic, and Trey Jones a little bit deeper down in that developmental core, versus some of the mainstays from the last half decade, all pretty much on expiring contracts, between LaMarcus Aldridge, DeMar DeRozan, Patty Mills, and Rudy Gay. So in your opinion, how should the Spurs balance the kind of duty towards development versus immediate competitiveness? And maybe those are the same thing. Maybe the best way to compete is developing the young talent. Curious on your thoughts on how they should kind of negotiate that.
Yeah, so I definitely think that for now, with Pop, as long as he's head coach, that they're going to try to push for the playoffs. There's no doubt about that. I don't think that he really wants any part of a full-blown rebuild where, you're just losing a ton of games. You're trying to get into the top of the lottery, acquire talent that way. But, it's going to be really tough. If I were in their, shoes, I'm looking at this roster. I'm going, LaMarcus Aldridge, I don't want him to be here long-term. I think he's more of an obstacle to the way that they're trying to play the game. He's only going to get older. He's only going to get slower. And we've seen him, continue to try to shoot threes, be more, more modern as a player. But I think that it's going to be tough for him, especially on the defensive end, to continue to adapt. For now, we see him, play a lot of drop coverage, and I don't think that he has a lot of utility outside of that. He's not a switchable guy. He can hold his own with some of the guys who like to bang around the post, but even then, like guys like Karl Anthony Towns or Jokic or Embiid, they're just not going to be hindered by him all that much, especially in the coming years. I think they're best to move away from him. I think the same thing can be said for DeMar DeRozan. I think he has more utility than LaMarcus does at this point. Because he can still be kind of your engine of your offense, keep the ball moving. And he was second in the NBA in three-pointers assisted last season, right, under Giannis Antetokounmpo. So I think he can still create, can still be useful in that function. And at the end of games, he can score, if he can.
He was great at the end of games in the bubble, either Absolutely. Just creating what may be a broadly inefficient analytical shot, but he makes them so often, and especially late in fourth quarters, I think the calculation changes on that a little bit, because you just need a guy who can create a decent look. And you saw that in the bubble, right?
Definitely. And like for most players, that mid-range shot is not a good shot, but that's his bread and butter. And, we don't love seeing him shoot that all the time. And he passes up a lot of 3-pointers. And obviously the preseason is not the regular season. And I'm not saying he's going to carry this over, but the 2 3-pointers he's had wide open, there have been no hesitation from him this preseason, and he knocked both of them down. Normally, he would catch it, hesitate, look around, and then maybe he'd drive to traffic, and then they'd have to reset the offense. But he shot them with no hesitation so far in the preseason. I think that kind of bodes well for his future in San Antonio potentially, but I do think that he should probably be on the move. They should try to take advantage of teams looking to add an extra piece to push them into that title contender status. And if they can do that and really hand the reins to the young guys, I don't think I think that is the best way to go about this business. And in terms of Rudy Gay, I think he's the same kind of way. He's a little outdated in terms of not outdated is the right word, but he doesn't fit the timeline of the Spurs. Right. He has this tendency to start seasons hot and then taper off throughout the year. His legs don't carry throughout the year. And, I just don't really buy it. In the bubble, we saw him play really well, but what happened? They were on a long hiatus. He had a ton of time to rest, ton of time to get his body right. I just don't buy it happening, as he continues to age, that he's going to be good for a whole season again. I don't think that's going to be the case. But if he can go to a contender where he's playing, 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes max, he can be really useful for them off the bench. But right now he's been in the starting lineup for the Spurs in the preseason, and I just don't think that's the way to go. I think they should move off of all those guys. The only person I would be remotely interested in keeping long-term is Patty. He's the last connection to that 2014 title team. And I think that's important, having somebody who's been integral to their culture. And he's a large part of what they do. He's part of, and I'm not sure, I'm sure you're not super familiar with it, but he has this thing called the coffee gang where he brings all the players in, the new players, some of the veterans, and they go get coffee together. They take selfies together. And it's kind of like a team building, team bonding thing. And even when he's not playing, he's, in the bubble, he picked up the clipboard a little bit. He was coaching on the sidelines a little bit with Pop. Even when he's not in the game before the bubble, he's rooting for teammates. He's waving the towel. He's, in young guys' ears, letting them know, hey, you can do this better. Hey, you can do that better. And I think it's really good for the chemistry. He's not a guy who's selfish. He really embodies that selflessness that you want to see from your veterans. He's going to be in the same mood. He's going to be engaged regardless of how much he plays, how many touches he gets. And I think that's important to keep around because it's hard to win when you're a young team. And it's even harder when you have no direction from any veterans. And as much as LaMarcus has kept this team afloat, as much as DeMar has been a really big part of bringing these young guys along, I don't think that they need to be there for the future. And for that reason, if you move away from them, and like I said, really give the keys to the engine, to the team, to these young guys, sure, they may not win a ton of games because they don't have that A1 talent that's going to be your superstar or future all-star, but they do have good complementary pieces so that, you're improving these. And then if you're back in the lottery, especially in 2021, if you're in the top of the lottery, even like mid-lottery, I think you can find a player who you can potentially build around. And when you have those other complementary pieces who are now seasoned, who have this experience, who are getting better every year, I think that's really good to surround them as opposed to bringing in a guy and saying, okay, well, you have to save us year one, Yeah. And I'm really excited to see what player and what position they get, because there are several players I have my eye on. Obviously, Cade Cunningham is like the top prize for everybody, but there's guys like Jalen Green, there's guys like Jonathan Kuminga, you got Usman Garubas if you're later in the lottery potentially, and I think they can all bring something really valuable to this team. I still think, though, in this NBA, you've got to have a superstar to win. And I know Spurs fans have been telling me, no, you don't. You don't have to have a superstar to win. Look at the 2014 Spurs. Kawhi wasn't the superstar yet. Manu, Tony, and Tim were on the decline. That's an outlier. So to me, that's as much of an outlier as the 2003 or 2000, or it was 2004, I think, Pistons that won the title against the Lakers. Sure, they did not have a superstar per se, but they had a lot of really good players. But that's more of like the exception than the rule. And I think if they want to be competitive, they've got to find that guy who is the franchise player, or they got to be able to attract him in free agency. And they're not going to be able to do that unless they, one, have the cap room, which they will have about $50 million projected this offseason. And two, you got to have a reason for that player to come, right? So if they don't have guys who are convinced can help them win, they're not going to show up. So I just think it would probably be better for the Spurs to try not to tank necessarily, but, organically lose. I mean, if you have these guys, you don't have the A1 talent, you don't have a real superstar, then you're probably going to lose games. And I think that's okay. It's just, there is no Tim Duncan. There is no, David Robinson, if there is no losing. And I'm not a huge fan of losing, but if there was a time to lose, it would probably be now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And honestly, I think it's fascinating how it plays out because, there's all sorts of different situations that could arise, whether that's, like you alluded to, Aldridge or DeRozan being a piece for a team that feels that one of them pushes them over the edge to be a championship contender. And what do you and what is the market like? And if you have leverage in that situation, what kind of assets can you get back? I do kind of like the idea of Patty Mills returning. Like you said, you still want some semblance of a veteran professional in your locker room, I think. And Patty, frankly, is still a pretty productive player. So
Yeah.
I think he balances that pretty well. And it's going to be very interesting, especially as we get towards the trade deadline, on which way does this Spurs team lean. And it's going to be interesting to watch the lineups configurations to see how willing Popovich is to play some of these young guys together and at what rate. So that all being said, you've kind of already made clear what your opinion is if you were in charge, but what are your just expectations for this team? And how good do you think they can be?
Yeah, like I said earlier, like as long as Pop is part of this team and he's pretty much the heart and soul of the Spurs, he's not just the coach, he's basically the front office. As long as he's there, they're going to try to be competitive. Maybe if things go south towards the trade deadline, they look at trading these guys, but I honestly think they're probably going to run it back and try to do their best job at integrating LaMarcus Aldridge and Trey Lyles into this small ball sort of lineup. Pop was talking again, like to the media the other day, and he said, look, I don't remember making the playoffs. I don't remember winning a championship. So something's got to change. And, to me, that signals that he's willing to continue changing. He's willing to continue adapting and going small. And even after this last preseason game, the Spurs took 38 threes in the first preseason game, 31 in the second. And that was last season. They only did that in about 40% of their games where they shot at least 30. And Pop came out after the second preseason game and said, look, there were a lot of threes they left on the table last night. I want them shooting those. And just a few years ago, he was talking after a playoff game and said, look, I think the three ball is like the worst shot in the NBA. I hate it. It's made the game ugly. And here he is today saying, hey, I want them shooting more. So I think he's going to probably play these young guys more. But I don't think he's going to fully push, a Patty or a Rudy or LaMarcus or DeMar out of the lineup. I think Patty still provides that spark off the bench. He's a reliable scoring option. You know what he's going to bring you off the bench. Rudy, to a certain degree, I think he has his nights here and there. He's not as consistent. But with DeMar and LaMarcus, I think they can still be very useful for this team. And I don't know. I don't know where I think they're going to finish. It's really tough predicting that, just because the rest of the West, in my opinion, got better.
Yep.
And I think the Spurs got better with additions by subtraction of Brenton and Marco, but I don't know that they got much better than any other team. So I think they might be in that play-in game discussion, maybe like the 9th, 10th, 8th seed area by the time we reach that point of the season. But I don't think they're going to be any better than that. And I know some people have kind of written about, well, they could surprise. Well, we hear that from every team. Every team's confident on opening day. We can do this. We're going to, gonna come out there and, XYZ player really improved, and then reality sets in and you go, wow, they weren't as good as we thought. And to me, I just rather be realistic and say, they're probably a fringe playoff team, rather than give people hope that they're going to be a 5th, 4th, 3rd seed, because they don't have the talent for that. They don't have the talent for that, and they don't have the experience together.
Yeah, and look, I'm as guilty of it as anyone, of drawing conclusions from a highlight in a preseason game. But to your point, like, large sample size, it reveals the truth, and that's just how it is. And over a season, you get a true feel for how effective a player can or can't be. So I think you're dead on that. Noah, this has been incredibly informative, I think, for our listeners, for NBA fans, of course, for Spurs fans that are kind of looking for a nuanced and thoughtful dissection of their offseason and of their season looking forward, frankly, and just kind of around the more philosophical debates about what this roster breakdown should look like moving forward. Cannot thank you enough for coming on and sharing all your knowledge with us. Tell all the Witch Carolina listeners where they can find your written work, your podcast work, and on social media, all that good stuff.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me. It's been an absolute blast talking basketball, Spurs basketball more specifically. And yeah, people can find me at Twitter at @n_Magaro, Magaro. I have a YouTube channel, so you can find me there as well. It's my name, Noah Magaro-George. I do a bunch of Spurs stuff. I also do some, breakdowns of other teams. I bring guests on. It's a good time there. And then lastly, you can find my writing at Pounding the Rock, an SB Nation network, and we cover the Spurs there. A lot of great writers, good, fun people there, and check that stuff out because it's definitely worthwhile.
Yeah, I have long enjoyed interacting with and reading your content on Twitter. So definitely recommend all your stuff to NBA fans out there. Look, we'll have to have you back on after the season gets underway, maybe 20 or 25 games in, and kind of update our conversation on what this roster looks like, what this young core looks like, and that good stuff. So we'd love to have you back on.
For sure. And, I sincerely hope that the Spurs make a fool of me and they end up better than I expect. That, I'm always hoping for them to succeed. I don't want fans to think that, I'm rooting for this team to lose. I'm absolutely not. Nothing would make me happier than seeing them succeed. But I'll definitely have to join on because, like I said, this was so fun. I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing than talking basketball with someone who also knows basketball. So again, I appreciate you bringing me on because this was a blast.
All right, man. Well, that's it for us. Thanks for listening to the Which Carolina podcast. Take care, everybody.